I do want to mention that some of you know me, most of you may know me, and I have the same introduction. My style is totally conversational rather than a formal presentation, and I start always about my name. I came to the States in 1961 as a foreign graduate student and became a faculty member at Columbia in '63. And in 1963, my colleagues who did not know how to pronounce Indian names or my name basically said, we'll call you JAG, like in Jaguar. And ever since that association, I've been dreaming of owning a Jaguar with a license plate, JAG's JAG. Why not, right? And the dream became a reality when I turned 60, 19 years ago. So I'm 79. Do I look 79? That's because in marketing, first thing we learn, it's all about packaging, right? True story, I have two grown-up children, both married, always joked about Jag as in Jaguar, and they surprised me on my birthday. Usually around Labor Day it happens. And I go out to get my newspaper, local AJC, and I turn around and saw this beautiful Jaguar, top of the line, XJ, some model, I guess. Even the color I like, parked in the driveway with a handwritten license plate, JAG's JAG, happy 60th birthday. It turned out to be a rental car. So I'm still looking for my Jaguar. You know, this story was okay. I've been doing this startup all the time, but interestingly, this is the reason why these kinds of initiatives are very important to look into the future. Nobody would have imagined 15 years ago that the state symbol automobile, like Cadillac for the United States, Mercedes-Benz for the Germans, that the British Empire's official car, Jaguar, will be now owned by one of the ex-colonies enterprises called Tata Motors. Isn't that interesting? I tell you, in my wildest dreams, I would have never imagined that happen. In my wildest dream, I would have never imagined the rise of China and India, let's say 20 years ago. China, we knew quite a lot was coming along, but nobody expected. That will become number 2 economy, surpassing in GDP, Japan, Germany, England, France, etc. And it is the knocking the doors of becoming number 1 economic power in terms of GDP. In fact, this year's data, 2016 data, I think, World Bank data already shows you that if you measure on purchasing power parity, which I think is a better measure because of the currency fluctuations, etc., China is already $20 trillion economy, followed by United States, 18 trillion, India about 8 trillion, which is slightly underestimated because of the cash economy. It's about 10 trillion, and the rest is the history. The 3 most economic blocks used to be, or nations used to be, US, Canada, North America, not counting Mexico. The 12 common market countries, the Western Europe as we call them, before the European Union, and the later entrant was Japan. These 15 nations control the world economy, and in the process, the politics and the world institutions. And combined together, they generated 70% of the world GDP in terms of all the value add. The trade was about 45%, mainly because many of their colonies supplied them raw materials, industrial raw materials, whether they were in Latin America or in Africa, or agricultural raw materials, for example. So the trade is about 45%. But this is 1987, and then we saw the rise of trade in the early 90s by abolishing all the trade restrictions called the GATT, creating, in fact, the World Trade Organization as an arbitrator in some fashion, because we all knew that in the 80s, after the first energy crisis, domestic growth is not going to be the engine. So we created a huge liberalization through trade following Ricardo's theory originally, which is fascinating, and there are implications for OBOR now, and that's what we did. Trade was the growth engine for about 25 years, but remember, trade has never been the architecture of international business. Before the early 90s, it used to be always investment, not trade. And of course, now we are likely to go back again, very likely that the trade will be substituted more and more by direct investment, which has a huge impact again on the OBOR, which is trade-oriented thinking, but it turns out to have an investment angle behind. With the Trump administration announcement that all the deals are off, TPP is dead on arrival, which was a big trade architecture, that most of the bilateral, multilateral deals will be renegotiated, like the NAFTA, and they're doing it right now. So not only if you want to keep it, but you have to do it differently. And the 5 nations with which there's a trade imbalance in this for you now from the United States viewpoint, China obviously the largest one, but followed by the NAFTA countries, Canada, Mexico. But the 4th one is Germany. Think about that. The 5th one is South Korea. So all the trade imbalances of the United States, which is the largest importer of most of the products and materials, turns out to be these 5 nations. And now they are saying, come to the table to talk directly and make it more balanced trade, or invest into each other. So you will see this move back to pre-90s, back to actually more and more foreign direct investment, either through acquisitions of corporations, existing businesses, or putting brand new factories. The architecture is not that different than what happened after the first energy crisis, where Japan actually as a nation pretty much was motivated by Reagan administration in this country to say, you cannot export your cars, you must invest in America. And all the 3 large Japanese automakers put their plants here: Honda, Nissan, Toyota. You will see the same architecture coming back. Germans are already investing massively. Their plants in this country, all 5 German automobile makers are making cars here rather than exporting from Germany, for example. And Germany always has been the best export-oriented nation, always. If you look at the ratio of export to GDP as a measure, Germany excels all other nations, surprisingly. It is in this context the new triad power emerges, which is United States, but India and China, which I think is very important to understand, and the role OBOR will play in the process. So let me just show you the first major slide around here. The main point I want to make is that OBOR is here to stay. No matter what the political pushbacks by anybody, it is inevitable architecture. And here are the reasons why OBOR is here to stay. The first major reason is that the whole world economy is now pivoting toward Asia for growth. Not just trade, but trade and investment, as I mentioned earlier, which is very important. If Asia is going to be the global driver, as America was in the last century, and the colonial powers, especially British Empire in the 1800s, we need to understand what happened to infrastructure investments at that time. So world economy is pivoting to Asia. There is no growth left in their own nations. Most of the advanced countries are aging and aging faster than they realized. Domestic growth is 1.5%, 2% maximum, and they see Asia as a large growth engine. If you now take the European Union as the largest trading bloc, which is about $1 trillion internal trade among those 26, 27 nations pre-Brexit, now the larger trading bloc is likely to be Asia. It is about to cross also $1 trillion, which means Japanese trading with China, South Korea trading with China, China trading with the ASEAN bloc, China trading individually with countries like Myanmar, for example, or even North Korea for that matter, or Philippines, etc. Very important to keep that. So the trade will be battleground in Asia, as the trade was the battleground in the colonial days, the mercantile age, for example, or as it was in the 20th century, last century, with America. There's a clearly realignment of Europe's future. Europe is definitely saying, continental Europe, that America is not our friend. Fascinating. We have never trusted continental Europeans. British have never trusted them. So continental Europeans are saying that we cannot rely on our old partners. We will align, therefore, wherever we can. All politics are becoming more pragmatic rather than ideological driven. So Europe is already going in that direction. As you know, right now negotiations are going on, led by Germany within the European Union, about how do we align with the Asian countries, primarily China. Surprisingly, in my crystal ball, I see Russia looking east now. While it was preoccupied with the whole issue on the border with European Union, for example, the NATO alliance and counterbalancing the Cold War, it certainly finds that it can find enough good partners on the Asian side. Again, China comes out as a dominant player. And shift toward east by Russia is more strategic than we have ever analyzed. Economic interest followed by political protection, if in some fashion, followed by military presence, for example. One of the very key areas that is happening as a part of the OBOR movement is you need resources for the next generation of the third industrial revolution primarily, and most resources are now in Africa. So OBOR has implications for the African markets through maritime routes primarily, and Africa is on the rise. In fact, second half of this century, we'll be talking about Africa with the same disbelief, excitement, enthusiasm as we are talking about China and India right now. And Africa is on the rise. Africa combined together is about a $5 trillion economy in the PPP, about 1 billion people. All of them want to become brand-conscious middle-class consumers. If you just travel to Africa and look at the local people, not the educated and college students and professors, but local people, they're all wearing T-shirts, they all have cell phones, they're into the modern world in consumption, which is a huge, huge, therefore, opportunity. If Pan-Africa can organize itself as a large continent, it's a huge continent. So we think that the second half of the century, remember, these are long-term projects, so one has to look at 50 years, 100 years out as to what is going to happen. That is one more factor. The two institutions America built after World War II through Bretton Woods Conference, along with their allies, basically World Bank and IMF, seem to create this, have the economy and politics steered toward the Western perspective. So now Asia says we'll create our own institutions, and those are two, as you know. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and the other one, of course, is the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS countries primarily. Both are very important, likely to be substitutes for the IMF and World Bank. It's a matter of time. I think Western world is in a denial stage that they will never happen, as we were in denial stage about rise of China itself. Before that, when Japan, for example, nobody believed Japan will become #2 economy or China will become #2 economy. Now, I think same thing is going to happen about these institutions, investment, financial institutions. So now we have this power play going on between two institutions which are well institutionalized worldwide over the last 50, 60 years. Are they getting marginalized in the process? And are AIIB and New Development Bank taking over the lead wherever they have a foothold or they have an interest, which is obviously more in the Asia-centric approach. There is going to be more and more what I call multilateral economic collaborations. The traditional collaborations that we know today will be replaced, which are more ideological, political collaborations. Democracies aligning with democracies, social architectural, societal, let us call it communism on the one side or socialism, they are aligning among themselves in some fashion. I think now all of that will be superseded by multilateral economic integrations, and there may not be as much geographical proximity as we thought. I was an advocate of groups or regional groups. But I'm now changing my own view that the grouping of economic integration will take not just nearby geographies, the proximity theory, but may happen across ways that we have never imagined, and that is likely to happen. Last one, and a very key one, is that there is a huge surplus of capital. I think we have never understood that. Most of the capital is primarily the energy prices going up more recently till about $100. The total amount of windfall money, people who have energy resources, is estimated to be about $20 trillion. That money is waiting to land someplace. You heard Norway alone has now $1 trillion of reserve. Think about how small that country is. And they are investing. But that money is up for grabs. In fact, Dubai, in my talk with them maybe 7 years ago, wanted to have 4 trillion of the 10 trillion within the Gulf countries and Russia to be housed in Dubai as a capital, let's say as opposed to London, as opposed to Singapore, as opposed to New York, or maybe some other place. He says, I would like to have 40% of the Gulf countries and Russian, this excess capital, they don't know what to do. We can manage very well by creating either sovereign funds or whatever they do, very different approach. This money is so big, it's going to call the shots. And you have already seen about the Aramco and the start of Aramco, right, in Saudi Arabia. So wherever there is oil, there's a huge surplus of capital which is not in the traditional institutions of equity market, the debt market. And the biggest winners are going to be from now onwards the private equity people. So I'm basically tracking private equity people. Goldman Sachs of the world are fine, but actually it would turn out to be more like Blackstones of the world. That's very important. We need to watch them because that's a huge money, which is what actually Japan invested in terms of their Zybastus for global expansion. China Investment Corporation of their own, it's the same way. Singapore has done very well. That's very important, and I think we have not understood the impact of this huge capital sitting on the sidelines, not finding enough investment opportunities with sufficient risks in the process, which is very key. And which leads to, obviously, the private-public partnerships. Not only private, public, but maybe NGO partnerships, which is very fascinating, three-way partnership. And that gives you more flexibility rather than being regulated by the politics of the organization. In many ways, you set aside. So between that surplus capital, AAI, AIIB, and New Development Bank getting access to that capital, private-public partnership, this is the project of the century. I think the phrase that is used by China's president, Xi Jinping, this is the project of the century, I believe in that. While there may be skeptical countries all over the world, whether it's doable or not, at least from a capital viewpoint, capability viewpoint, it'll be done. And that's because if you look at the history, OBOR to me reminds me as same as the 21st century architecture of what happened with America investing enormously, both in maritime as well as in physical infrastructure in the 20th century and in 1800s, following David Ricardo's thinking by and large, which is a comparative advantage trade theory. British invested massively worldwide in infrastructure, from railroads, for example, to ports, and creating a maritime as well as a physical route. So to me, when I looked at OBOR, well, it sounds more China-centric, because it was American-centric before, it was the British-centric before, actually turns out to be a global architecture. Most of these investments, if you look at it by the British Empire, were not in England, please. Most of the investment made by the American century, last century, was not just in America, although it's a big continent, it was worldwide. Most infrastructure usually has been local or national. This is the first time you see a global architecture, which has its implications, which means who controls that, who governs that, who manages that, who protects it. We have the Suez Canal. You have the Panama, for example, as gateways. Think about all those infrastructures done, and this is a repeat of the same thing. So it's not a big surprise to me that OBOR is necessary. Why would this be necessary? When the economy is that large, the existing capacity of infrastructure has reached its limits. Ports are clogged. If you go to the west coast of America, all the way from, let's say, Long Beach in Los Angeles area, or Oakland in California, northern, all the way to Seattle, it's just clogged. Ships are waiting forever. In fact, ships go empty because there's no export from America onto the Asia side. Ports like Singapore Port have become #1 out of nowhere. Rotterdam always was the historical port under the, I guess, Dutch, Indo-Dutch, Anglo-Dutch, alignment at that time, which is interesting. So if you look at the ports, how clogged they are in Singapore right now, or Hong Kong for that matter, if you just look at the Asian ports, there is just not enough capacity. That will be true for land-based cargoes, whether those are highways or whether those are, in fact, railways, whatever they use, multi-mode transportation. So that's very key. It's going to happen. Rather than deny it, rather than fight it, question is, what are its consequences? So this is my second slide that talks about the consequences. Especially, I've taken the view, let me look at the lens from India. And the lens of India is very interesting. So this is what I see happening as a consequence of OBOR. And just like there was a mistrust please when the British began to have East India Company expand the infrastructure, just as there was a mistrust with the American investment in infrastructure worldwide, there will be a mistrust about OBOR, whether the intentions are strictly economic or the intentions are also military. And that makes everybody nervous. But it's nothing new again. It has happened before. So what are the consequences? My view is that OBOR is creating ramifications or side effects in some fashion in a positive way for India. Japan's investment in India will speed up enormously now, much faster. There's a sense of urgency to counterbalance this whole initiative and therefore the dominance of China through infrastructure, not just through labor and not just, in fact, hardworking people, not just whatever they have done. And if you analyze the Chinese exports, which is again very fascinating, my estimates are running that 80% of the Chinese exports have nothing to do with Chinese corporations. All of that is just for cheap labor, value add, lack of regulations, to send your raw materials there, do the value add, and come bring it back. So most of the brand names, at least in the consumer products, we know are all American or European brand names. Which is, China has learned a lot in the process. Is no longer a cheap goods nation. Like Japan did. Japan basically abolished the low-quality products from an export viewpoint, rose the quality. Japan became #1 in quality at one time, surpassing Germans, surpassing Americans, etc. You see a similar architecture around here. It's making everybody say that China will become so competitive with the infrastructure advantage and resource advantage, technology advantage. No matter how we look at it, we need to counterbalance. And in the counterbalance, India is becoming a very strategic nation for the world, but in the neighborhood will be China and Japan. So Japan will massively invest in India much sooner, much larger than we thought. And of course, there might be a free trade agreement between India and Japan. Similarly, by the way, what is happening to Japan is going to happen with South Korea, which is a pretty large economy for a small size. In India, South Korean brand names dominate in appliances, for example, like a Samsung or LG both in consumer electronics as well as in white goods, as we call them pretty much. All you will see huge ramp up of investment from the Asia side, but also from the other side, which is Europe. There's a fast track of India-US strategic alliance now. Neither country can wait to negotiate, go through the political process. How do you do it fast track? So the strategic alliance, which is primarily military alliance in some fashion, fast track, which has its own consequences. And you will see now pretty much orthogonalization, which means separation, independence between economic side and the military side and the political side as we go forward. We always be combined together. In the last formation of the triad power, we defeated Japan, we defeated Germany, so America can call the shots about how we do business. What are the right institutions? How do we mediate whatever happens? Today, these three nations have different legacies. China has a communist legacy. The people who are in charge grew up with a different mentality and thinking. India is more like a mixed economy. Don't trust capitalism fully. Make sure there are checks and balances. In America, of course, we believe it is raw capitalism or cowboy capitalism. Capitalism is the format with which we can get ahead. And if it fails, if the markets fail, then we can do something else, which means we intervene, etc., as we saw in the economic recession of 2008. So this is very tough. This new trilateral does not know who will balance with whom because they are not on the same page. And I don't think US has the unilateral power to dictate terms anymore, either on China or on India for that matter. So you will see huge opportunities for others in the process. So this is the fast track of India-US military alignment, strategic alignment. India, in process, will have to modernize its military much faster than it would have done it. So budgets be damned. And militaries are often, in fact, off-balance sheet activities. So it turns out to be very interesting. If you look at the history of the military investments by nations, it's not this traditional trade approach of doing it, counting as exports, imports. There are other mechanisms. So I see modernization of the Indian military much faster, much sooner as a consequence of the OBOR. It's interesting. OBOR in India is not even participating, but is getting reaction or benefits or whatever word you would like. Next one is a very important point. World will look for outsourcing their manufacturing to other places than China. I've got to diversify my risk. And I believe India will be the one that will become as the second largest sourcing destination. It has a financial institutions right. It has legal institution right. They know the British and the American systems. All it does not have is infrastructure as much or capacity scale-wise. India is very big in size, but doesn't have scale. So if Walmart today wants to buy $8 to $10 billion of denim, nobody can supply it. So how do you now create, either through policy or through market process, a very large-scale supply function where, again, infrastructure comes in play within the country to take those goods out to the ports, ship it out, whatever you do. So, but India will become the second sourcing destination very quickly, more than we have realized. Growth of India's physical and financial infrastructure in the process, our financial institutions in India and physical infrastructure institutions are quite behind. So now one has to either create brand new ones or put more and more, in fact, modernization. The banking sector. And I've been publicly an advocate, India has just too many banks. You have the scale, size, but not the scale. They're all national banks. Who says they have to exist independently? Why not aggregate them into a super organization and suddenly an Indian bank like SBI, which they've already done it by policy, they're government-owned enterprises anyhow, you can become the second or the third largest bank in the world. Now you have a scale on a global basis. That's what India needs to do through policy reforms across all of the state enterprises. That's true of insurance. That's definitely true of oil industry, which they have just done it. 4 oil companies are integrated into one super holding vehicle primarily. Those are the architects that are very necessary for it to think differently than the traditional way we have thought. So growth of India's physical and financial infrastructure is there. It will compete for the same capital that other people are competing by and large. India will become, therefore, an investment destination. And I think India has already surpassed. I think India now, as of September or August, is the largest foreign direct investment. I've always advocated for countries like India, foreign institutional investment is just not right. Because I can pull out the money through brokerage anytime I want within 1 week's notice. And if I invest heavily into the stock market, I can create a havoc with your stock market. But if I have my physical infrastructure in your country, FDI, then it's a very different story. So more and more FDI is what we are encouraging for countries like India as opposed to stock market primarily. And we have seen that buffeting of the stock market in the Hong Kong market, for example, or maybe in Singapore market, etc. Those are basically very small nations. So there's not too much foreign direct investment, but a lot of trade, stock market investment. So that's clearly. And the last point is that out of nowhere you will see the rise of India as a soft power, both in Asia and in Africa. And India always had great soft power anyhow. It has never been a military threat to anybody. It has always played that game of being a diverse democracy, has roots under the British Empire all over the world. Indian citizens, wherever they were settled, have done very well. They are not minorities who are actually looked down by majority. Many parts of the world, India provides the teachers for colleges and for high schools. All those are sort of admired assets of a nation. Only thing it's lacking now is world-class brand names of Indian origin where they are admired because you get soft power through brands, very large, as much as you get soft power through embassies, etc. So we think India's soft power will rise, especially in the Asian theater, neighboring countries. So those are the things. So contrary to popular belief, India will actually benefit from OBOR initiative, and the more OBOR initiative is looked upon by the world, perceived as a military adventurism, the more you will see the benefit happening to the neighbors in a very different way, which I never thought about it till I began to put my research and thinking behind. So what about future of India-China relationship, which is the last slide I have. Surprisingly, number one point is that India and the China, Indo-Chinese relationship, a lot would depend on countries' continuity of political leadership. Both nations are hoping and praying that the political leadership will continue because it changes dramatically. If you look at the Xi Jinping's policies compared to the previous administration in China, if you look at the Prime Minister Modi's policies compared to the previous administration, Trump administration here compared to previous administration, you have a huge, actually, whiplash of policy changes. So political continuity is absolutely important no matter who analyzes what about the future of India-China relationship. And we are all hoping that there will be political continuity, one through democracy, other one through succession planning, how I do it between the two nations. That will be very important, in my view. Other very important event is that if there is any major conflict of the magnitude of world wars, there is no more Third World War in Europe. European Union has basically pacified by creating a one bloc in many ways. You can't go to war with each other. There is none that I see in Latin America, which comes to that magnitude, where the whole world participates. I don't see one even in the Middle East, which looks like such a messed up thing right now through civil strife and all the conflicts there. I don't see that. It will be contained, that, but Asia definitely has the potential. And nuclear weapons are not the solution. They are very good defensive mechanisms. The only way you don't go to war with each other is to have strong economic cooperation where your people live in their country, their people live in your country, your assets are in their country, because then that's the typical prisoner's dilemma, hostage holding. So if there were 1 million Chinese living in India and 1 million Indians living in China, you have to think twice before whoever wants to be an aggressor, because it has political consequences even in a non-democracy, for our information. So I'm very watching with intent about the Asian conflict. To me, the land is very brittle, just like California or Arizona. And locals know how brittle the land is, but when a typical camper from the other parts of the country goes to Yosemite Park for family campfire, they don't know how to put out the fire before they leave as tourists, and all of a sudden you see a fire which gets out of hand. Very, very likely. And there are about 5-6 hotspots. While our attention is on North Korea right now, I think it's more than North Korea. So one has to watch that and track very carefully, because if there is a major conflict, everything stops. Just World War II stopped quite a lot of activities, except military-based activities. So that's what I'm thinking more about and worry about it more quite a lot. My view is that economic pragmatism will be the key to increasing the trust coefficient. And I've never seen more asymmetry of trust between two nations as between China and India. In other words, they are both mistrusting each other, we understand that. Both trusting each other, we understand that. When one nation totally mistrusts the other and the other nation does not mistrust as much, something is not right in the way the propaganda in the nation, in the way media talks about the other country is probably there. Something is there. It's the ethos of the world, of the nations, as to why you don't trust the other nation. And to me, it's very important to have that the trust coefficient between two nations rise in the process as OBOR initiative takes its hold. Third is very clearly very rapid growth of bilateral tourism. Tourism is a very fascinating industry. When people to people travel into each other country, they already think differently. And the largest tourism now, export-wise tourists, are from China, surpassed Japan, surpassed America. And we also will have the largest tourists going to China worldwide. Seems like it's a very good policy by the Chinese. And the more we encourage tourism between China and India, more the average citizen understands, especially in a democracy, it's very important for them to say, they're okay. So tourism becomes a very key strategic asset for creating trust coefficient, and greater cultural and educational exchanges. We do that with India and America, for example. Have you seen how many students are studying in America now from India? It's pretty large. Is it possible to have similarly large number of Indian students studying in China, or large number of Chinese students studying in India, for example? In the last strategic alignment with the Soviets, India actually had an enormous number of visitors, scholars, students going to Soviet Union. It's possible. So that's really what we are advocating around here. The next slide and the last point, and I'll stop here, is that we will need definitely bilateral investments to balance the trade imbalance. Today, like America, China exports a lot more to India and buys a lot less from India. So one can do that by bilateral investments, which means can Chinese be interested in investing in India rather than exporting to India, and will India accept those investments? There will be certain sensitive industries, like we are not allowing Chinese to come here in certain industries, but many others, we are saying, okay, you can buy companies, the assets around here. I think there's going to be, so one has to balance the investment, bilateral investments, to imbalance, reduce the imbalance in trade. I also believe very strongly that when these things happen, when the borders are tense, it is very important to have military to military dialogue. very key. The military generals, especially professional military, think very differently. And military-to-military dialogue becomes very essential so that they don't trigger quickly without anybody's approval. Wasn't there an incident like that in 1983 or something where Soviet person, there was some, he just think was passed away or something, where they thought in the Cold War that we had launched missiles against them. And he was the tracking person, and he basically ignored that it is, otherwise he would have created a huge nuclear Armageddon, right? So military people are very important to have a trust factor with each other besides the political leaders. And therefore, track 3 or track 2, third-party facilitation will be necessary. The question is, which country will do that thing? We had a Vienna, remember, between the Cold War between the Soviets and the Allies. So which city will become the place where the Chinese and the Indians get together to make sure that as conflicts will be always there with the neighbors, how do we manage through rather than create a lot more? Because any kind of a military adventurism is just not good for either nation, essentially, which is interesting. So more likely it may be Singapore as a city. Interesting. Like Vienna came out of nowhere. So we are watching whether the Singapore will become a good host behind the scenes as somebody who says, if you want to meet here, we are willing to have you host around here, whether it's a political aspects, diplomatic side, economic side, and especially military side. So what I see around here is the opposite of what I thought. I thought OBOR will be detrimental to India, but this analysis says that actually by just sitting on the sidelines, India will become a major beneficiary out of nowhere, which I don't think even the Chinese have thought about it. That's my presentation. I will stop here. Thank you very much. Do you want me to pick up any questions now or no? Any questions by anybody? Yes.
Great talk. My question is a great idea to repackage issues between India and China, so therefore hopefully to improve their relationship. I was wondering, do you have any suggestions about how to repackage the border disputes, territorial disputes between two countries?
Unfortunately, it is going to be harder because of the history. And I'll make this comment more like a joke and then come to serious stuff. I find that, especially in democracies, in America would be one example I can take, the policy advisors never die. They live forever. So they have seen World War II. They have seen Cold War. So their mind is always from that perspective. See what I'm saying? India still remembers colonial days. India still remembers, in fact, Cold War and the non-alignment. There are people who are very respected who continue to be the advisors. So long as you have those, it'll be very difficult. Any country. My analysis of Chinese succession planning leadership is that when there's a change in the leadership every decade or so, they bring in different set of advisors who are younger, Western educated, interestingly, and see the world because they have no memory, history, or living experiences of what happened. I'm a refugee from Burma. When Japan rolled over in 1940, 1941, just like Syrian refugees, we lost everything. Now I have no memory. Therefore, I have no mistrust about Japan, for example, in my mind. I'm personalizing it, but I'm trying to tell you, this is the key issue. It's nothing to do with policy document. It's the person-to-person memories And what do you do? And I don't think India has still forgotten the 1962 Hindi, Chini, bye bye, and that people still remember that. So long as they remember, it will be hard. So the other party has to go out of their way to say we are not the same anymore. So to me, to repackage, the initiative has to come from China in a very significant way, because China has a low trust coefficient among Indians. And surprisingly, it's universal, which is what very fascinating. If you talk to the taxi driver in cities in India, if you talk to campus students, if you talk to, in fact, intellectuals, if you talk to policy advisors, they say we don't trust China. So Chinese trading practices have to change. And by the way, that's true for China worldwide, I think. Chinese investment strategies have to change to say, how do I increase the trust factor as a China, as a nation that is rising, and people, the rest of the nations begin to believe. So that's the key factor, in my view. I think packaging otherwise will not do much. You have a very deep ethos in that nation, in India, for example. So I don't think the policy guys and the politicians meeting each other can solve that thing. Only antidote I find is that when you have these huge people-to-people exchanges, where you say, my God, they're just as human beings as I am, then you begin to have a little more, at least the mass market trust factor can go up essentially, but not otherwise. I'm sorry to be somewhat pessimistic on that side. There's a huge asymmetry of trust. Yes. Yeah.
One moment. Can we get this on the mic, please? I'm just going to bring this mic around. Who is here?
Thank you. Thank you, Russell.
Just one more question and then
Yeah, okay.
What is your forecast for the role of the major Indian corporate entities such as Aditya Birla, Tata, going forward? How do you see them evolving?
We think that Indian corporations have never thought themselves, especially in the private sector, as national champions. They've never associated themselves as something they can do for the nation, like soft power, right? That was true for the Zaibastus in Japan, and that is true for the state enterprises in China. And therefore, my recommendation has been to India, don't talk about the private sector enterprises, which are capitalistic primarily, but the state enterprises, which are still about 40% of the economy, they are the larger ones. Those state enterprises must be globalized as fast as you can. Whether it's a State Bank of India, which is the largest bank by huge size compared to ICICI Bank, which is a private bank, for example, or whether it's Life Insurance Corporation of America, that is probably the most innovative life company in the world ever. They have done how to get life policies done for the poorest with no credit rating. Over their life, they have done very well, but they're domestic. Just like state enterprises in China were domestic in their mindset. Now they're becoming global, whether it's Huawei Technologies or Lenovo, for example, or Haier that just made the GE appliance acquisition would be number 2, number 3 company in America, for example. So to me, state enterprises are the best things to do. State enterprises have stated goal of serving the country, like military have, in some fashion. So I'm more strongly focusing on state enterprises and how can we globalize them as fast as we can, pretty much. That'll be what I think so. The private enterprises can come in only one way, which is what Japan figured out through policy by investing in quality movement. They hired Deming from us, and basically made quality control and motivated all the Japanese corporations to have quality obsession. And these 12 Zaibastus all followed that. I don't see that kind of a following in the Indian enterprises yet, in my mind. They will do it from a competitive viewpoint, But if the competition is not that strong, why would they do it? So I worry about that, relying on the private organizations in India. Even though I admire them on the one hand, clearly. Some of them are quite good, but they don't have national agenda. They have a strictly capitalistic agenda. Okay? last comment, yeah.
Jag, you didn't mention Pakistan.
Yes.
I assume that's one of the 5 areas of tension that you listed North Korea, but you didn't mention India and Pakistan.
Yes.
Isn't that going to be a constant disturbing factor for Indo-Chinese relations?
It'll be a constant factor in that Asia theater, clearly, whether it's a Pakistan, China aspect is one that I'm watching more carefully. Historically, as you know, Pakistan is made who they are by the United States. Militarily, we supported them strongly. Even today, we do. And I think we have to look at history of that first before any other nation says we will adopt Pakistan. I think, to me, this impasse is a lot longer than we thought. And I'll be very open in my comments. Pakistan has a very unstable situation. The 3 power bases are not on the same page. You have the elected body, then you have the ISI and the intelligence guys, and then you have the military. So people who are experts on Pakistan more than I am, I'm saying Pakistan probably has no choice going forward except to have another military coup, which is the only way Pakistan has come out in any kind of internal messes by and large. We don't know if that happens, what is the future. As it happened in Egypt, as you know, same thing. So many of these countries have this trilateral power base. And the question is, which of those power bases will prevail? So it's more the uncertainty about the future of Pakistan as opposed to China-Pakistan relationship. That's more critical to watch, in my view, pretty much. Pakistan and India have tried over time to see if there is some way one can use economics as a way of bonding the two. But I don't know. I'm not as optimistic. Last time the government tried or worked for a while, we are back to the same way. I think it is in the self-interest of Pakistan, unfortunately, to continue some sort of a conflict in the situation for their own survival, which is a theory Pakistan will not buy, obviously, you know. So this is an outside view about Pakistan. But it's very interesting, though. To me, Pakistan issue, which used to be the front burner issue from the India's ethos in some fashion, has shifted now. The belief is that Pakistan can be managed. With the strategic alignment here from US, for example, our investment in Pakistan declining over time, for example, a bunch of reasons. So hopefully something will happen. But I'm not an expert on the geopolitical. I'm more on the economic side. Great potential. It's just like Cuba here. Great potential. Pakistan population is large. If there was an economic trade and investment alone, if nothing else, they will both come out very well. Each one has certain areas where they're very good in what they do, provide access to those, and vice versa would be the key one. But I don't know, it can happen without political will on both sides. I have to stop here. Thank you very much.